Hi, this is Penny. Welcome to my studio. In this video I'm going to show you how I made some cloth with a variety of scrap pieces, and they're fairly large scrap pieces that can be cut into strips. But if you organize them in a certain way, you can get a really deep layered effect, and I'll show you step by step how I do that. This is a sample of the piece of cloth. Select a range of threads that go with your fabrics. They can be both plain colours and also variegated. The variegated threads add that little extra pizzazz, I think. First we're going to look at making the fabric, and then we're going to look at making the bag. So it's in two parts. If you prefer just to make the fabric, that's fine, then you can stop when we get to the bags. Otherwise you can go right through to the end and you'll see how to make the entire thing. The bag that I'm going to focus on is the red bag, and it uses fairly large scraps. Looking a bit closer, you can see that the center panel in the red bag is vertical, the stripes are vertical, and on the side panels they're horizontal, whereas on the other bag the center panel has horizontal stripes and the side panels are vertical. It really doesn't matter which you do, that's totally up to you. And here again we look just at the one bag that we're going to focus on. Notice that it does have a frayed edge around the center panel, and we'll look at how to do that as well. First of all, you have to select your materials. Now, I suggest selecting more than you need. I had about 11 fabrics here. I didn't use them all, but I kept the colour range in reds and violets with complementary greens. So once I'd made the bag, I found that I'd only used 7 fabrics in total. The top right and the bottom right and the floral one I used for the top layer of the fabrics, and the other 4 I used for the bottom layer. And I wanted layered, different layers, because it makes the fabric look very rich. Your base layer needs to be a sheet of green, or whichever colour you use, it has to be the larger piece. And it needs to be the size of the finished piece of fabric that you need. And then I sprayed it with applique adhesive, which is removable, and then I laid rough cut squares, rectangles. It doesn't matter, you don't have to be exact. You just put them down like you would on a chessboard. And I chose the unsaturated sort of darker brick reds for the backing, and laid them down, and then I started laying the darker brick red with the gold in it. Both of those will show through, and the green also will come through in tiny patches. And there you can see all the squares laid. The next step is to add my bright colour, and so I cut rectangles, and I laid them diagonally across the piece of fabric. After I'd got them all in, I actually stitched. You can see the white dotted line. I just stitched with red right down each side. It hardly showed, but it just held them in position. So the next step is making the top layer of the fabric. Here I got the 3 top fabrics. One was a floral, one was a variegated red, and the other was a patterned violet. And I cut strips from them approximately 1.5 centimetres wide. It doesn't have to be exact, and they don't have to be really straight. But I cut 4 strips from each fabric and laid them down in the order that you can see. On the left you go floral, and then the variegated red, and then the patterned violet. And then I repeated that right across the piece of material. You can still see the diagonals underneath. They will disappear a little bit once we embroider it, but they do sort of create the impression of an underlying layer, which is what I wanted. Here you can see where I've stitched down the side of each strip, And instead of just using a plain stitch, I've used embroidery stitches in different colours of cotton. Basically, I used mostly single coloured cottons. Towards the end, I used a couple of variegated. And I did that just to spread the colours around. I wanted to spread the yellow, for example. There were a couple of patches in the fabric, and I spread them around by using a variegated, yellow variegated thread. It just unifies the whole thing. And as you can see, it covers it quite well. And then here again we see it with more embroidery on it. On this one I've actually embroidered between the strips. In fact, I've covered every single square centimetre on this fabric is covered with embroidery. And if we go back to before it was embroidered, you can see the difference. So you have the unembroidered stuff, and now you have the embroidered, and it's vastly different. In a close-up here you can see the kind of stitching I've used. It's not very straight, but I wasn't worried again. I don't really mind that. And you can see that I've used fairly open stitches over most of it, a couple of more solid ones, but the open stitches allow the colours to show through and the pattern to show through, but they just change it and unify it. So that's basically the end of the fabric piece. So this is where you stop if you don't want to make the bag. Before we go on to the bag, however, we'll look at the second bag, the gold and blue one, and this was made differently. This was a lot simpler. It wasn't deeply layered. It was on black, a piece of black polycotton, and I just literally cut long little rectangles and joined them into stripes down the fabric. And then I used gold, blue and violets, but when I had finished, the gold was a bit too bright. I thought the yellows were a bit too bright, so I actually dipped these, or painted these rather, with dilute wood stain, which sounds a bit strange, but it's diluted with methylated spirits, and it was a teak colour, and I painted it on, and then it was a bit too dark, so I rinsed it under the cold tap and most of it came out, but it left this beautiful golden tone. And you can also see on this image that I stenciled the flowers on one end, and I just used gold paint. I didn't underlay any whites or anything. I just used a straight gold paint on it. So that's basically the second piece, and you might prefer to do yours like that too. So doing the stenciling design, now I used a cheap stencil. I'm not sure whether I got it at a thrift shop or a cheap shop, I'm not sure, but it just has flowers and leaves. I didn't use the whole stencil. I just used the flowers and the leaves. So any stencil that you've got that serves the purpose is fine. It needs to be long and narrow because it's going in your centre panel. First of all, I painted white through it, and in retrospect I think I would probably not have painted white, and also if I had, I would have made it a bit thinner, but you know, that's how it was, so I worked with that. And then I painted the white with gold. Now, I could have laid the stencil over and re-stenciled with gold paint, but it was easier to use a fine brush and just paint gold on them, and you can see some are done and some aren't. So the next step then is to make the flowers a little more colourful. So I added a translucent pink pigmented ink over the gold, and then touched up the centres with an Inktense pencil just to darken the centres of the petals. Also, at this stage, you can see that I've actually free machined around each flower, each petal and each leaf, just to make them stand out more. So that's done now, so we'll put it aside. And the next thing is to actually make the panels themselves. You can see them here cut out, and you can see what they look like on the black fabric. And here you can see all the sizes. So if you want to make the bag the same, these are all your sizes that you need to copy. You'll notice that the centre panel has a fringe of black hessian around it, and we'll look at how he did that shortly. And the other two panels are different sizes. One is much narrower than the other, and then there's the circle as well. So those are your measurements. And on the other bag, these are the panels, and this one has its fringe on it too, but they're just rough at the moment. So we'll look at now, the next thing we've got to do is look at constructing the bag flap, because you've got to have that finished basically before you can stitch your panels on. We need to get some stiffener, and I found this at the thrift shops. I think it's for cross stitch or something like that, but it's really nice and stiff, and so I thought I'd use it behind the fabric. So you can see the measurements on there, and that's the exact width of the panel. I'm not allowing any seam allowances here because you won't be seaming it at all. Then you add it to some thin wadding. You lay a piece of thin wadding underneath, put your stiffener on top, and then you trim along the edges, both sides, and along the bottom of the bag, and shape the corners if you want rounded corners. The white part on the right of the red dotted line is going to go down into your bag, and that dotted line is where you're going to be sewing your flap to your bag. To the left of that, the white area is the fold-over area of your flap. So you need the measurements on there right up to the sewing line. On the right-hand side, you can just do another 4 or 5 centimetres. It's not critical. Here you can see the panel laid onto the back of the bag fabric. I've cut the bag fabric about 2 or 3 centimetres longer on 3 sides. The right-hand end doesn't matter because that's going down into the back, but the other ends need enough to turn over. And I've tacked it in white cotton so you can see it easily. First of all, I tacked the corners in, and then I sewed around and tacked it down. Then I turned it over and I actually stitched close to the edge with black cotton, just to make it look neat. So that's basically your flap. Now, to finish that off, we've got to put the pieces onto it, and in order to do that, we need to do a few things in preparation. One of those is to make some handmade cord. You may prefer to use a commercial cord. It needs to be fairly thin, but if you want to make your own, you just use a single thickness of rainbow-coloured yarn or black, any coloured yarn, it doesn't matter. And so that this image doesn't actually show the cord that I used. I started with 3 thicknesses of 8-ply and twisted them and machined them, and for some strange reason everything went wrong. Anything that could go wrong went wrong, and the cord was terrible. But it was also too fat. So I used 1 strand and I made a piece of green cord, and it was perfect, so I used that. And you can see it being used shortly. So to get your center panel ready, you need to use your black hessian or linen or any black fabric that frays really easily. And you need to lay your center panel down as straight as you can along the grain of the hessian. Just try and get it really straight because you're going to want to fray along the edges. And if it's crooked, that won't work very well. So sew it down either by machine right on the edge or by hand. It doesn't matter how you anchor it as long as you sew it down. And then get your cord and start sewing that right up to the edge of the panel. I sewed it by machine and it was all right for half of it, but then it went funny. It just didn't work properly. So I sewed it by hand. So you can do either. You might prefer to sew it by hand because it's probably quicker in the long run. And there it is finished. I've cut the ends, I've butt joined them, and then stitched over them. So that's now a solid piece that's anchored down and frayed. And then you're going to add it to your flap. And you can see the flap and you can see the loop. You need to put a loop on the flap at this stage. Make sure you've got a button that's the right size and make sure it fits through that loop, and then put your loop in the center of the bottom of the flap. It must be central. If it's not, the flap won't hang straight. And you can see I've put my main section on of the design. Then I've butted the other two little sections up to it, tucked them underneath the frayed edge, and just pushed them in until they butt up with the cord of the center section. And then I've put cord on the two outer parts and also around the circle. And you can place the circle anywhere, doesn't matter. I've used the golden mean principle here to put it in, but you can put it anywhere, and I've used it diagonally just to break it from the vertical and horizontal. And also you'll notice now that I've also put beads in the center of the flowers. Though you can bead them any way you like, stitch them, embroider them, it doesn't matter what you do. But do that before you actually put them onto the base, obviously. So there it's on the flap. So that basically the flap now just needs to be lined. And there we are with I've used black polycotton to line it. It doesn't look very dark in this image, but it is actually jet black. And you can see on the left, you'll see the red dotted line. That's your sewing line for inserting the flap into the bag itself. And you can see the loop has been inserted under the lining. So that's the end of the bag flap. Now we have to look at the bag body. So we'll look at how we make that. You have to cut two pieces, as it says there, cut two pieces of fabric and two pieces of wadding the same size. This is a generous measurement. I like to allow a lot more and trim it off rather than find that I'm too short. Here you can see the green line and the stitching line around the bag, the seam stitching. So if you follow this, you can't go too far wrong. Once you've sewn down the sides and across the bottom, you need to reverse your bag, turn it inside out, and taking each corner, place the side seam along with the bottom seam exactly, and flatten it out, and you'll have the corner going to a point, and you stitch over the corner of that, definitely no more than about 2 centimeters. And you stitch across at 90 degrees on each corner, and that'll leave you with 2 rabbit ears, which you trim off. And then you turn your bag the right way out, and you should have a nice base on your bag with a width of maybe 2 centimeters, something like that. Here you can see from the outside, you've got the sort of a T section there. Yeah, it just looks really neat and rounds the corners off a bit. Now, turn your bag inside out again and fold down the amount of turn down that you want. Probably around about 2 to 3 centimeters is usually fine. And then pin or tack along the top of the fold, not where it's not the bottom part, but along the top of the fold around the bag, just so that you can see the line of the fold from the outside. Using the diagram with the green line on, sew your flap to the back of the bag. This takes a little bit of pinning and placing. Make sure that it's central and also that the fold down is uniform on both sides. It can be a little bit awkward. If in doubt, just pin it and then tack it before you sew. Your flap, when you've sewn it into your bag, should be equidistant from each side seam, and also it should be approximately a centimetre smaller on each end than the actual width of the bag. This is going to allow the shoulder strap to be sewn in. Now we're finishing off the bag. We have to make a shoulder strap and we have to make the closure. Now cut yourself a small square of the Aida cloth or the stiffener that you used, or denim, any tough fabric, and pin or mark where you want your button to be, your closure button. Then take this little square of stiff fabric and put it inside the bag and stitch it through the bag as you sew the button onto the outside of the bag. So you should have a layer, the stiffener on the inside, the wadding, the bag fabric, and then outside you've got the button. That just stops the button pulling a hole in the fabric. It probably won't do that anyway with the wadding, but just to be sure. Here you can see the bag flap sewn into the bag, and then the bag itself is lined and stitched across the bag, the flap and the bag seam. You can see here that the shoulder strap should fit neatly on each side seam, and when you stitched it down it should look something like this. This is why I make the width of the actual bag body very slightly wider than the front flap of the bag, because it allows the strap to sit neatly, and you can see that very clearly here. I think, yes, definitely my favourite one is the one on the right. I'm really not a red person, but that's how you do the fabric anyway. And basically that's how I do most of my bags. I think I've said before in previous videos that I like to do my panel or the front of my bag as a little work of art and then build a very simple bag around it. And I find it works for me. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. And until next time, thanks very much for watching.